There's a deed buried in this soil, and it didn't just change who owned the land, it changed who was allowed to love who. You can stand out there today and see nothing but a plain old field, sun-bleached grass, a tired fence, a single tree that refuses to fall. But if you listen close, the land still tells the story. My name is June. I'm old enough now that my hands shake when I pour tea, and steady enough that I'm finally going to tell the truth. Because before this is over, you're going to know what that hidden deed said, who signed it in secret, and how one broken promise divided my family into two branches that barely spoke for half a century. And I'm telling it now for one reason: they're talking about selling the land. Developers, clean shoes, bright smiles, standing where our dead are buried in memory, measuring the place like it's empty. But it isn't empty. Not even close. Have you ever noticed how a place can feel crowded, even when you're alone? After rain, the whole field smells like iron and crushed green, like the earth is breathing through its own mouth. In the evenings, when the light goes honey-colored, you can hear crickets start up in the ditch line like they're turning on one by one. And if you walk near the fence, our fence, the one that shouldn't have ever been built, you'll hear the wire sing when the wind hits it just right. That fence is the first lie. A line hammered into the ground to make something wrong feel official. I used to run that field barefoot as a girl. The ground would be warm on top, cool underneath, and sometimes the dry dirt would puff up around my ankles like smoke. Back then, the land didn't feel divided. It felt like one big, open breath. But the grown-ups, they moved like the land had teeth. "Don't cross that fence," my mother would say, not looking me in the eye. Not because of snakes. Not because of thorns. Because of family. And what does a child do with that? A child believes the fence is normal. A child learns that love comes with borders. We called it the Hollow Road Field. 27 acres if you count the low, wet corner that never grew much. To strangers, it was ordinary. To us, it was an inheritance and a warning. There's an old sycamore at the center, thick trunk, pale bark that flakes like old paint. That tree has watched more prayers than a church pew. And if you get close enough, you can still see faint cuts in the bark, two sets of initials carved so carefully you'd think the carver was holding his breath. I didn't understand those initials until I was almost grown. And when I finally did, I realized the land had been trying to tell me the whole time. So let me take you back. Not with dates in a history book, no, honey. With the way it felt. With the heat in the air. The taste of dust. The sound a screen door makes when someone leaves angry. Because the beginning of this story isn't a courtroom. It's a porch light clicking off late at night. It's a boy's boots in the dirt. It's a promise spoken so softly it was almost a sin. And it all leads to one piece of paper, one hidden deed, signed behind a brother's back. My grandfather, Gideon, bought that land the way men did back then, stubbornly, painfully, like he was wrestling God for it. He didn't start with much. A rented house, a mule that bit, and hands that never stopped moving. He had two sons, Everett, the oldest, and Thomas, 2 years younger. Everett was quiet in a way that made you lean in. Thomas was quiet in a way that made you watch your purse. Now, don't mistake me, I love them both. But love doesn't change what a person is. Everett could mend a broken tool and make it look like it never suffered. Thomas could take a whole room's attention without raising his voice. And then there was Ruth Carraway. She lived on the other end of Hollow Road, past the bend where the trees crowd in close. Her family had land too, good land, and a last name my grandfather said like it had a bad taste. Old grudges. Old accusations. Things no one wrote down but everyone remembered. Have you ever seen two families hate each other so long they forget how it started? That's what it was like. Everett met Ruth near the sycamore, on a day that smelled like clover and sun-warmed sap. He'd gone out to fix a fence post. She'd come to the creek for watercress, her sleeves rolled up, hair pinned back like she meant business. He offered her his canteen. She took it like she didn't owe him a thank you. And something about that, about her not acting impressed, hooked him deep. They didn't fall in love loudly. No grand announcements. No public hand-holding. Just small things, a glance too long, a smile that arrived late, a careful step closer when no one was looking. My grandfather noticed anyway. Men like Gideon notice anything that might take something from them. He had plans for Everett. Plans that involved a local girl named Hazel, a marriage that would settle him, and a handshake arrangement with Hazel's father that included, among other things, land. Because the truth is, Gideon's dream was always bigger than what he could afford. The bank was sniffing around. The tractor he wanted cost more than pride could cover. And the hollow road field, our field, was the anchor that kept everything from tipping over. So when Everett's heart wandered toward Ruth, Gideon didn't just see romance. He saw a threat to the whole structure. One evening, the three of them sat at the kitchen table. Oil lamp lit. Cornbread cooling. The air thick with the kind of silence that makes food taste like sawdust. Gideon cleared his throat and said, "You'll marry Hazel." No question mark. No room to breathe. Everett's jaw tightened. Thomas looked down at his plate like it was suddenly fascinating. Everett said, "I won't." And that was the first time I ever heard about the sycamore, because my grandmother, Lillian, told me later that Gideon stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor like a shout. He pointed toward the window, toward the dark outline of the field. He said, "Everything you are is out there. Don't forget who bought it." Everett didn't yell. He just said, "I didn't ask you to buy my life." And that sentence, soft as it was, landed like a hammer. That night, Everett walked out. Not forever. Not yet. But long enough to meet Ruth under the sycamore with a lantern turned low. They stood on the grass with the creek whispering nearby. Ruth's hands were shaking, and Everett kept his own behind his back so she wouldn't see his. He told her his father would never allow it. She told him she didn't need permission to love. He told her love wasn't the only thing at stake. And then Ruth said something that would echo in our family for decades: "If you choose land over me, don't call it duty. Call it fear." What would you have done if you were Everett, torn between the ground beneath your feet and the person who made you feel alive? Everett asked Ruth to run away with him. Not to anywhere grand. Just to the next county, to a little rental near the rail line, where they could work and start fresh. Ruth looked past him at the field and said, "Your father will burn the world down to get you back." Then she touched his sleeve, barely, and said, "And he'll burn me first." So they made a different plan. A slower plan. A careful plan. A plan that required one thing Everett thought he could trust: his brother. Thomas came to Everett a week later by the barn, when the sun was sharp and the hay dust floated like tiny ghosts. He leaned on a pitchfork and said, "You're making trouble." Everett stared at the ground, then at Thomas, and said, "I'm trying not to ruin her life." Thomas asked, "Since when do you care about hers more than ours?" Everett didn't answer that. He said, "I need you to do something. Now, here's the part people don't understand unless they've lived in a family where land is identity. Signing away land isn't just paperwork. It's admitting you can be erased." Everett told Thomas there might be trouble, real trouble, if Gideon decided Ruth was a stain he could scrub out. Everett said, "If something happens to me, if he cuts me off. I don't want him going after her family's place too." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "And what does that have to do with me?" Everett said, "I want you to hold my share. Temporarily." Thomas blinked once. "Hold it?" Everett nodded. "A deed. Quiet. Just in case." Thomas let out a slow breath. "You're asking me to help you sneak around our father." Everett's voice dropped. "I'm asking you to help me keep her safe." Then he added, "And I'm asking because you're my brother." Thomas looked away toward the field, toward the fence line that wasn't there yet. And after a long moment, he said, "All right." But the way he said it, it wasn't yes. It was leverage. That's the thing about betrayal. Sometimes it starts as a favor. They met a lawyer in town, Mr. Pritchard, who kept his office above the hardware store and smelled like old paper and peppermint. Everett didn't want Gideon hearing a whisper of it. So they went midday, when Gideon thought they were hauling feed. Everett signed. Thomas signed. The lawyer stamped. The paper slid into a folder like a secret going to sleep. The deed transferred Everett's interest in the Hollow Road field to Thomas. Not for love. Not for greed. For protection, at least that's what Everett believed. Everett said, "You'll give it back when this blows over." Thomas smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Sure," he said. And right there, right in that dusty office with the ceiling fan clicking overhead, was the moment the family split in two. Only none of them knew it yet. Because the real damage doesn't happen when a signature dries. It happens when the wrong person finds a way to make it permanent. 2 nights later, Gideon confronted Everett on the porch. "My grandmother Lillian said she heard the voices through the screen door like thunder trapped in cloth." Gideon accused Everett of seeing Ruth again. Everett didn't deny it. He just said, "I love her." Gideon's face went still. Not angry, worse. Decided. He said, "Then you're not my son." Everett stepped down from the porch, boots hitting the dirt hard. Lillian begged Gideon to stop. Thomas stood behind Gideon, quiet as a nail. Everett looked back once, just once, and said, "Don't do this." Gideon said, "You did this." And Everett left. But before dawn, something else happened, something no one talked about in full sentences. A truck drove slow down Hollow Road. A door slammed. And by sunrise, Ruth Carraway's father had a bruised cheek and a warning, "Keep your daughter away." No one admitted who delivered that warning. But everyone knew. What does a young woman do when love becomes dangerous? What does a young man do when his father turns his anger into action? Ruth stopped coming to the sycamore. Everett waited anyway. Night after night, lantern low, standing where the grass was flattened by his pacing. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived. Not to Everett. To Gideon. And that's when Thomas made his move. The letter was from Ruth. Short. Polite. The kind of letter you write when you're trying not to cry on the page. She wrote that she would not see Everett again. That she wished him well. That she hoped the trouble would end. And that was all. Gideon read it aloud at the table like scripture. Then he looked at Thomas and said, "Good. Now we fix what your brother broke." Thomas nodded. "Yes, sir." Within a week, Gideon announced Hazel would marry Thomas instead. Not because Thomas loved her. Because Hazel's father still wanted the handshake deal, and Gideon still needed the security. Thomas didn't protest. He said, "If it helps the family." Everett heard the news from someone else, at the feed store, of all places. He stood there, holding a sack of seed, and the world tilted sideways. He drove straight to Hollow Road and walked the field like it might explain itself. He found Thomas by the sycamore, leaning against the trunk like it belonged to him. Everett said, "You're marrying her?" Thomas said, "Someone has to." Everett's voice was low and sharp. "And Ruth?" Thomas shrugged. "Ruth made her choice." Everett stepped closer. "Did she? Or did we make it for her?" Thomas's eyes flicked, just for a moment. Then he said, "This is how it has to be." Everett's hands balled into fists. He said, "I need my share back." Thomas's mouth tightened. "Your share?" Everett nodded toward the field. "The deed. You said you'd hold it." Thomas looked out over the land and said, "I did hold it." Then, without looking at Everett, he added, "And I filed it. And it's mine now." That sentence was the match. Everett lunged, grabbed Thomas's shirt, and shoved him hard against the sycamore. Bark scraped. Leaves shook. Thomas didn't fight back. He smiled, small, cruel, and said, "Go ahead. Hit me. Give father another reason to erase you." Everett's breathing turned ragged. His grip loosened. Thomas straightened his collar and said, "You wanted to protect her. Congratulations." Then he leaned in and whispered, "You just sacrificed yourself instead. Some fences are built from wood. Ours was built from shame." Everett walked away from the sycamore like a man leaving a grave. And the very next morning, a crew of men started hammering posts. A new fence went up, crooked, hurried, like they didn't want the land to see them doing it. Part 9. It cut the hollow road field into two uneven halves. Thomas's side got the better soil. Everett's side, what he was allowed to keep, was the low corner that flooded. Except Everett didn't keep even that. Because he didn't have the deed anymore. He didn't have the power. And he didn't have a father willing to fight fair. So Everett left the county. And for a long time, Ruth disappeared from the story like she'd never existed. But the land remembered. Oh, it remembered. Years went by the way they do in farm country, measured in harvests, not holidays. Thomas married Hazel. They had children. Gideon grew older and harder. And Everett became the family's unsaid word. If his name came up, someone would clear their throat. Someone would stand up to refill coffee that didn't need refilling. Someone would change the subject like flipping a record. As for Ruth, people said she moved away. Some said she married a man with a steady job. Some said she never married at all. And some, usually the cruel ones, said she got what she deserved. I was born into the divided version of the story. Born after the signatures, after the fence, after the shouting had cooled into a quiet frost. I didn't meet Everett until I was 11. And when I did, I didn't know who he was. That's what secrets do. They don't just hide the truth. They rearrange your life around the hiding. When I was little, my world had two halves. There was our side, where my father, yes, Thomas, walked like every step was counted. And there was that side, where the fence ran and the grass grew just the same, but we acted like it was another country. Part 10. One summer, I chased a butterfly. A white one with black-tipped wings, fluttering like it couldn't decide where to land. I ran after it, laughing, until the fence wire was right in front of my nose. I reached through without thinking. And my father's hand clamped around my wrist so tight I yelped. He didn't yell. That would have been easier. He just said, "No." And the way he said it made my stomach drop. "Why?" I asked. He looked at the fence like it had spoken. Then he said, "Because that's how it is. Not because it's dangerous. Not because it's private. Just. That's how it is." Have you ever tried to build a childhood on a sentence like that? Here are the small scenes that made the division feel permanent. Not one big event, no, those are too easy to point at. It was the steady drip of it. Scene 1, a wedding. My cousin Ellie got married in the church on Maple Street. White dress, sweaty bouquets, folding chairs that squeaked when you shifted your weight. After the vows, we all lined up outside for photographs. And across the street, by the gas station sign, I saw people I recognized, same cheekbones, same eyes, standing apart like they'd been told not to touch. My aunt hissed, "Don't stare." But I did. Because a child can feel family the way you feel heat from a stove. No one invited them. No one asked why. They just stood there, watched, and left. And something inside me learned that celebration could have a shadow. Scene 2, a funeral. Gideon died in late October, when the leaves were all rust and bone. At the graveside, half the family stood close, and the other half stayed by the road. Not because there wasn't room. Because there wasn't forgiveness. The preacher talked about mercy. And I watched my father's face, tight, unreadable, and realized mercy is easy to preach when you're not the one asked to give it. Across the road, a man I'd never met, older, with shoulders like he'd carried too much, took off his hat. He stared at the coffin like he wanted to say something and couldn't. That was Everett. I didn't know it yet. Scene 3, Harvest. 2 combines, 2 schedules, 2 sets of hands. They harvested the same field like it was 2 different worlds. Dust clouds rose on both sides of the fence, and the wind mixed them in the air like the land was laughing at us. Land remembers what people try to forget. Scene 4, A Child's Question. Mine. I asked my mother once, did we do something to them? She froze at the sink, dishwater running, and said, we did what we had to. Then she added, so quietly I almost missed it, and we've been paying for it ever since. What does that mean to a child? It means you grow up thinking love is expensive. And somebody always sends the bill. When I was 11, I met Everett in the only place the family still shared without admitting it, the general store. It was summer. The kind that makes the air shimmer above the road. I was sent in for sugar and kerosene, and I wandered near the candy jars, staring like I had money. A man behind me said, pick the lemon drops. They last longer. I turned. He was sunburned, older than my father, with lines around his mouth like he'd learned not to smile too wide. I said, I'm not allowed. He asked, not allowed what? I nodded toward the candy. Not allowed to waste. He chuckled, but the sound caught halfway, like it hurt. Then he asked my name. June, I said. His face changed, just a flicker. He repeated it like he was testing how it tasted. June. Then he said, that's a good name. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a nickel, and slid it across the counter. Get the lemon drops, he said. I hesitated. My dad. He interrupted softly, don't tell him. And that made my skin prickle. The store bell jingled, and my mother walked in. She saw the man. Her face went pale like all the blood left at once. She grabbed my shoulder and pulled me back. June, she said sharply, come here. Then she looked at the man and said one word, Everett. Not a greeting. A warning. He nodded, respectful and sad. And my mother marched me out so fast the sugar bag tore a little at the seam. In the car, I asked, who is he? My mother's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She said, he's nobody. But her voice cracked on the last syllable. If he was nobody, why did her eyes look like that? Why did my heart feel like I'd just missed something important? Years later, when I was old enough to understand adult cruelty, I learned the basics. Everett had abandoned the family, Thomas had kept things together, and the fence was necessary. That's what I was told. That's what everyone was told. But the story never explained 2 things. First, why Everett still came back sometimes, quietly, like a man checking on a wound. Second, why Thomas kept a lockbox in the hall closet and watched it like a hungry dog. That lockbox is where the truth slept for decades. And I didn't know it existed until the year the land almost left us forever. This year, my grandson, sweet boy, big heart, came to visit and told me the cousins were meeting about options. Options. Such a neat word for something that can break you. They wanted to sell the Hollow Road field. Split the money. Stop paying taxes. Let somebody else worry about the fence and the weeds. I understood the practicality. I really did. People have bills. People have medical needs. People have children who live far away and don't come back. But when I heard sell, my stomach tightened like a fist. Because you can't sell what you still owe. And our family owed that land the truth. So I went to the old house. Not the one I live in now. The old one. The one with the porch that sags and the floorboards that squeak like they're complaining. The one that still smells faintly of wood smoke even after all these years. I climbed into the attic with a flashlight and a stubbornness I didn't know I still had. I moved boxes labeled Christmas and tools and Hazel's things. My knees popped when I crouched, and I muttered at my own body like it was a misbehaving child. I was looking for anything, that could explain why my family's love came with conditions. And I found it in the last place I expected, under a loose floorboard in the hall closet. Not the lockbox. That came later. I found a small tin, an old biscuit tin with a rusted edge, wrapped in a dish towel. Inside were papers folded so many times the creases had become permanent. My hands trembled as I opened them. And there it was, a deed. A copy, yellowed and thin, with names I'd heard my whole life. Everett's name. Thomas's name. The Hollow Road field. The date. I sat right on the closet floor, dust on my skirt, and felt my throat close. Because the deed confirmed what the family rumors never dared to say out loud. Everett had signed away his share to Thomas. On purpose. But then I saw something clipped behind it, 2 pages of handwriting, neat but urgent, like the writer was racing fear. A letter. And the first line turned my blood cold. It said, "If you're reading this, then my brother finally took what I gave." And underneath, "Forgive him, if you can. But don't let him rewrite me." Could you keep reading if your whole family history was about to change? I didn't have a choice. Everett wrote the letter to Ruth. Not to Gideon. Not to Thomas. Not to the court. To Ruth. He wrote that night after the lawyer's office, after the secret deed, after he realized Thomas's, yes, had teeth. He wrote that he was afraid Gideon would ruin Ruth's family if the feud flared into something violent. He wrote, "I gave Thomas my share so father would stop chasing blood." He wrote, "If he can't punish me through the land, maybe he'll leave you alone." Then Everett wrote the part that made me press my hand over my mouth so I wouldn't make a sound. He wrote, "Ruth, I will not marry Hazel. But they will use her either way." He wrote, "If Thomas marries her, father gets what he wants, and you might get to breathe." He was trying to trade his own future for her safety. That's what that deed really was. Not greed. Not foolishness. A sacrifice wrapped in paperwork. And then, this is the part the whole family got wrong, Everett wrote, "Tell no one about the baby until you are far away. My father would use a child like a rope. But I will find you when it's safe." The baby. I read that word and felt the attic tilt. I read it again. And again. Then I turned the page. And there, in Ruth's handwriting, because she had written on the back years later, was one sentence. "He never came, June. But you did. June." My name. The air left my lungs like someone had knocked it out of me. I sat there with the papers in my lap and understood, all at once, why my mother's eyes had looked like grief in the general store. Why Everett had said my name like it mattered. Why the fence had always felt like it was aimed at me personally. I wasn't just a child of the divided family. I was the proof of the forbidden love that started it. I was Ruth's daughter. Everett's daughter. Raised in Thomas's house because Ruth had disappeared to keep me alive, and then, later, when she couldn't carry it alone anymore, she placed me where she thought I would have food and safety. And Thomas, my father in practice, had taken me in. Not out of kindness. Out of control. Because if I belonged to him, the story belonged to him. You may wonder, how could a child not know who her parents were? Because back then, people were experts at silence. A baby could be called a blessing, and a surprise, and a mercy, and everyone would nod and never ask the wrong question again. I remembered suddenly, like a picture coming into focus, Hazel's face when she looked at me sometimes. Not hatred. Not love. Something complicated, like mourning. And I remembered Thomas watching me from doorways. Like he was counting what he'd gained. The letter explained the final piece too. Everett wrote that after he left, he tried to come back for Ruth. But Thomas met him at the county line and told him, "Stay gone. She's moved on. The baby isn't yours." And Everett, already bruised by betrayal, already convinced he was poison, believed him. That's the cruelty of a good liar. They don't just say something untrue. They pick the lie you're most afraid is real. So Everett stayed away. Ruth stayed hidden. And Thomas kept the land, and the story. Until my hands opened that tin. I didn't sleep that night. I made tea and forgot to drink it. I sat at my kitchen table with the letter and the deed and stared at my own life like it belonged to someone else. All those years of division. All those weddings and funerals and harvests done like we were strangers. And underneath it all, one man's sacrifice, one man's theft, and one woman who vanished to keep a baby breathing. What do you do when the truth arrives late? Do you still open the door? The next morning, I called a family meeting. Not a polite one. Not a, maybe if you're free. A real one. I told them to come to the old house on Hollow Road, the one that still had Gideon's shadow in the corners. I told them it was about the land. And that I had papers. You should have seen how fast people show up when you say, papers. They came in pairs and singles, stepping onto that porch like it might judge them. Cousins from Thomas's branch. Cousins from Everett's branch, yes, there was a branch, because Everett had eventually married later, trying to build a life on top of a wound. And they looked at each other like they were reading old scars. We sat around the same kitchen table where Gideon once commanded marriages. The air smelled like lemon cleaner and old wood. Somebody's knee bounced. Somebody kept checking their phone like escape was possible. Thomas was gone by then, buried 10 years. Hazel too. So the old generals weren't there to control the narrative. Just us, the people who inherited the consequences. I placed the deed copy on the table. Then the letter. My cousin Mark, Thomas's oldest grandson, leaned forward. He said, "What is this?" I looked at all of them, faces that held pieces of faces I'd seen in mirrors my whole life. And I said, "This is why you were taught to hate each other." Then I added, "And it's why the land has never felt like peace." Silence fell. Thick. Expectant. And I started reading. As I read, the room changed. At first, people looked skeptical. Then uncomfortable. Then, when the words, "the baby," and "June" landed, every head turned toward me. Mark's mouth opened. Closed. He whispered, "You're saying?" I nodded once. Yes. And the truth sat down among us like an uninvited guest. One of Everett's granddaughters, Lena, covered her face and began to cry silently, shoulders shaking. Not because she'd lost something new, but because she'd realized how much had been stolen from her before she was born. Mark's sister snapped, "This is a trick." But her voice wavered. Because deep down, everyone recognizes the shape of truth when it finally stands up straight. I slid the deed copy toward them. I said, "Everett signed it to protect Ruth. Thomas recorded it to take everything." Then I added, "And the fence was built to make theft look like order." Have you ever watched a family myth collapse in real time? It doesn't fall like a tree. It crumbles like a dry biscuit, slow, messy, impossible to put back together. Voices rose. Not screaming, most of us were too tired for that. But sharp enough to cut. One cousin said, "My dad said Everett abandoned us." Another said, "My mom said Thomas saved the farm." Lena said through tears, "He didn't save it. He stole it." Mark stood up and paced. He stopped near the window and stared out toward the field. After a long moment, he said, "If this is true, then our whole inheritance is dirty." I said, "Yes." And then I said something that surprised even me, "But dirty things can be washed." Mark turned. "How?" I tapped the letter gently, like it was fragile. I said, "First by admitting what happened. Then I gestured toward the land. Second by deciding what we want the field to be now. A weapon, or a table. A table. A place people come to, not a line people guard." Someone, quiet in the corner, asked, "Why didn't you say something sooner?" I swallowed. Because that question is always waiting, isn't it? I said, "Because I didn't know. And when I suspected, I was afraid. Afraid I'd lose the only family I'd ever been allowed to claim." Then I added, and now I'm old enough to know that allowed is a poor substitute for loved. That landed hard. Outside, the wind shifted. And the fence wire sang. Like the land was listening. We walked out to the field together. Not in a neat line. In a hesitant cluster, like people approaching an animal they once kicked. When we reached the fence, nobody touched it at first. We just stood there, looking at the posts sunk into earth that never asked for them. Mark reached out and flicked the wire lightly. It hummed. He said, almost to himself, all this, because of paper. I said, not just paper. Pride. Fear. And a love that wasn't given room to breathe. Lena walked to the sycamore. She put her palm on the bark where the initials were carved. She traced them like reading Braille. Then she said, ER. And on the other side, faint but there, RC. Everett. Ruth. A love story hidden in plain sight. Mark's sister, who had called it a trick, stood very still. She said softly, my grandma Hazel used to cry when she hung laundry. I thought she was just tired. Then she whispered, I think she knew. Yes. Hazel knew she was part of the bargain. Not chosen. Used. And she carried that quietly, because women back then were taught to swallow truth like it was medicine. I looked at the fence again and felt something inside me loosen, just a little. Because for the first time, we were all seeing the same thing at the same time. That's what truth does. It doesn't erase the past. But it stops the past from pretending it was righteous. We didn't forgive in a single afternoon. Anyone who tells you families heal like flipping a switch is selling something. But we did something else first, we stopped lying. Back inside, we talked logistics, because practical talk is how people survive emotion. If Everett's sacrifice had been used as theft, what now? If Thomas's branch had benefited, what responsibility did that create? Mark suggested splitting the land fairly between branches. Lena shook her head. It's already been split enough. So I offered a different idea, one Ruth would have liked, I think. I said, don't split it. Share it. Put it in a family trust with both branches represented. No secret deeds. No quiet filings. Decisions in daylight. Someone asked, and the sale? I said, if you sell together, with the truth told. But if you keep it, then make it a place that doesn't punish children for running. That's when Lena said the simplest, bravest thing, take the fence down. The room went still. Because taking a fence down is never just taking wood down. It's taking an excuse down. Mark nodded slowly. He said, my granddad put it up. Then he swallowed and added, maybe I should be the one to pull it out. I felt tears press behind my eyes, hot and sudden. Because that, right there, was the first real apology our family had ever spoken. Not in words. In willingness. A week later, we met at the fence with gloves, tools, and the kind of nervous energy you feel before a storm. The morning was cool. The grass wet with dew. The sycamore stood watching like an old witness called back to the stand. Mark grabbed the wire cutters and stared at the first strand. He said, last chance to stop me. Nobody did. The cutters snapped shut. The wire sprang back with a twang. And for a moment, everyone flinched, like we expected the past to strike us for changing it. But nothing struck. The sky didn't fall. The land didn't reject us. We worked slowly, pulling staples from posts, rolling wire into coils, stacking the old wood like we were dismantling an altar. Somebody found a post so rotted it crumbled in their hands. Lena laughed once, a surprised sound, and then cried. I stood a little apart, leaning on my cane, watching the line disappear. And I thought about Everett and Ruth standing under that tree, trying to build a future with nothing but whispered plans. I thought about Hazel hanging laundry with tears she never explained. I thought about Gideon, whose pride was so heavy it bent everyone around him. And I thought, what a waste. What a terrible, human waste. Have you ever grieved years you didn't personally live? I did, right then. When the last section of wire came down, Mark carried it to the side like it was something dangerous. He set it down and exhaled. Then he looked across the open field, no line, no warning, and said, "It's bigger than I remember." I nodded. "Peace always is," I said. And my voice shook. We planted something that afternoon too. Not because it fixed everything, nothing fixes everything. But because living people need a gesture they can return to. We dug a hole near the sycamore and planted a young oak. Small now. Fragile looking. But alive. Lena pressed the soil down around it. Mark poured water from a jug. And I took the last handful of dirt and let it sift through my fingers, feeling the grit, the life, the weight. I said quietly, "This land held our worst choices. Let it hold a better one." No one argued. We didn't call it a memorial. But that's what it was. For Everett. For Ruth. For Hazel. For the version of our family that could have existed if fear hadn't been in charge. Now, I won't lie to you and say everyone walked away smiling. Some people stayed angry, maybe they needed that, for a while. Some people stayed skeptical, because it's hard to accept that your comfort was built on someone else's quiet suffering. And some people felt relief so heavy it looked like sadness. But the next time there was a funeral, we stood together. And the next time there was a wedding, nobody watched from across the street. That's not a miracle. That's work. The Hollow Road field is still there. Still ordinary to a stranger. Still beautiful in the late light. But now, when the wind runs across it, it doesn't catch on a fence the way it used to. And me? I carry two fathers in my story, one who gave up everything to protect love, and one who raised me inside a lie. It took me a lifetime to say that without my throat closing. But I'm saying it now because I don't want the next generation inheriting our silence like it's tradition. I want them to inherit truth. Even if it stings at first. Because the land can hold pain for a long time. But it can also hold gatherings. It can hold laughter. It can hold a shared harvest. And if you've ever had a family divided by something that happened before you were born, maybe you understand why this matters. Maybe you've stood near a metaphorical fence and wondered who put it there. Maybe you've wanted to ask questions and felt the room go cold. So here's my gentle advice, from an old woman who waited too long: ask anyway. Not to start a war, no. To end one. The truth arrives late, but it still deserves a chair. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own people, your own land, your own hidden lines, please take a second to like this video. It helps more than you think, especially for a quiet storytelling channel like Dust of Old Days. And if you want more grandmother-style, nostalgic stories about land, legacy, and the secrets families bury, subscribe to Dust of Old Days and come sit with me again. One last thing. If you ever find yourself standing in a place that feels heavy, don't assume it's haunted. Sometimes it's just carrying what nobody dared to say. And sometimes, if you're brave enough, you get to be the one who finally says it. Good night, honey.